An elderly man was abandoned by his family and hid his wealth. But he fell in love with a young woman, and surprised everyone during the reading of his will. George spent his days in a small apartment in the city center, surrounded by bare walls that no longer held pictures or happy memories. His only constant companion was the distant sound of traffic and the gentle creak of the rocking chair he had inherited from more prosperous times. The apartment, once a vibrant home, now seemed more like a comfortable cell, a refuge where he lived isolated from the world that had forgotten him. His physical frailty was evident, but what no one saw was the strength that still resided in his mind. Sitting by the window, George watched the life outside with a distant yet attentive gaze. He saw people rushing by, busy with their own routines, oblivious to the old man who watched them day after day. There was a dark serenity in the way he had grown accustomed to solitude. Every object in his home, from the rusted kettle to the clock that had stopped long ago, seemed to echo a story he preferred not to revisit. Silence at some point became his most faithful companion. George's apartment had an air of abandonment, but not of misery. He kept the space tidy with furniture that had aged along with him, creating an atmosphere of discreet dignity. In the living room, a small bookshelf with books whose pages had yellowed over time was his only link to the past, a past he rarely revisited. Next to the bookshelf, a hidden safe, concealed by a dusty painting, held a secret that no one would ever guess. Although he lived simply, George was much more than he appeared. Beneath the facade of a frail old man, he hid a fortune he had amassed over the years, the result of careful investments and shrewd decisions he had made in his youth. But for him, that money was never the focus. He believed the real treasure lay in what money couldn't buy: affection, companionship, the feeling of being valued. And that, unfortunately, he had lost. The few times George left his apartment were for slow walks around the neighborhood, where each step seemed heavier than the last. He observed the unfamiliar faces that passed him, but rarely did anyone give him a glance, as if old age had rendered him invisible. There was something cruel about that kind of indifference, but George never complained. He had learned to accept being forgotten as part of his life, an inevitable reality. One afternoon, while walking through the nearby park, he felt the cold wind caress his wrinkled face. The trees, stripped of leaves by autumn, reflected the state of his soul. An old man, stripped of everything but his own dignity. George looked at the horizon with a deep melancholy, wondering if anyone would ever care about what he had lived, about what he would leave behind. It was as if his very existence was fading away, slowly, without leaving a trace. Back in his apartment, he sat once more in his rocking chair. The golden light of the late afternoon filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. There was a certain peace in that scene, but also a weight, as if time was about to demand payment for a long-forgotten debt. George closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence around him, a silence that, despite its familiarity, never failed to cause him a pang of pain in his chest. At night, darkness took over the small apartment, and George, instead of turning on the lights, remained there wrapped in shadows. The secret he guarded so well seemed to pulse in that dark environment, like a silent ghost that would never be revealed, or perhaps would be at an unexpected moment. The value of his fortune, however, meant little to him now. George knew that time was running out, and, with it, the chances that anyone would truly care about who he was. Yet, even amid solitude, something in George remained intact, a spark of hope. It was not for the money he had accumulated, nor for the chance to reconnect with the family that had abandoned him. It was the hope that, perhaps, somewhere, someone might still see the value he knew he possessed. Maybe, in an unexpected way, his life could touch another. That hope, no matter how small, was what kept his heart beating, while the world outside remained indifferent. At first, visits from George's family were frequent. On Sundays, his children came with the grandchildren, filling the house with laughter and cheerful voices. They sat at the table where George, with a proud smile, prepared dinner. The table was always plentiful, as was his heart. But gradually, without him noticing at first, those visits began to dwindle. An excuse here, another there, and the warmth of family gatherings faded, leaving George with an uncomfortable silence that grew each week. "I'm so busy at work, Dad," his eldest son James would say, holding his phone, responding to messages even during the rare family lunches. "The kids have so many activities, we don't have time to visit," his daughter Laura would justify with a hurried voice, already glancing at the clock, eager to leave. Those excuses became a constant, and rather than confront them, George nodded understandingly, although he felt the emptiness growing inside him. What hurt George the most was not the absence itself, but the realization that he had become a burden. He saw in his children's eyes a weariness, a thinly veiled haste to leave. The feeling that his presence, once a source of joy, had turned into an obligation. Conversations which once flowed naturally were now short, bureaucratic. "How are you, Dad? Do you need anything? Great, then we'll be going." And off they went, leaving behind an old man who, day by day, watched love dissolve into indifference. One time he tried to suggest a family reunion, a last attempt to bring back the happy days. "How about lunch here next weekend?" he asked with a timid hope in his voice. The answer came quickly, full of excuses. "Oh, Dad, it won't work. We're swamped with things. Maybe another time, maybe next month." George simply nodded, even though he knew that maybe would never come. The excuses continued, but the visit stopped entirely. The phone, which once rang almost every week, now remained silent. Sometimes he would look at the phone, hoping to hear the voice of one of his children, but he knew the call would never come. The silence that once filled the nights now invaded the days, and the house, which had once echoed with life, was now filled with the solitary footsteps of George. Time passed, and with it, the promises of visits became vaguer until they disappeared entirely. Not even on special dates, like birthdays or holidays, did George receive a phone call. "They're busy," he would tell himself, trying to justify the growing void. He repeated it like a mantra, trying to turn the pain into resignation, but the sadness in his eyes never lied. Deep down he knew he had been forgotten. In the rare casual encounters, like at year-end parties, George sensed the coldness disguised in polite gestures. James and Laura brought the grandchildren, but the moments were brief, almost formal. "We have to go, Dad, life is so busy," they would say. The word busy became a constant in the family's excuses, as if time for him had ceased to exist. That time, once shared with love, was now reserved for other priorities. Despite the growing pain, George never complained. He didn't want to be the burden that his family clearly saw. Instead, he offered tired smiles and silent goodbyes. "I understand," he would murmur, even if he didn't understand. Even though each farewell felt more definitive than the last, he preferred to swallow the bitter words that accumulated in his throat. There was dignity in his silence, a last remnant of pride that he refused to abandon. And so, the cycle of abandonment was complete. George watched from a distance as his children's lives moved on without him. Social media photos showed vacations, dinners, celebrations, but he was never invited. He watched his grandchildren grow up only through occasional images, a distant spectator of a life from which he had been excluded. While the world continued to turn for everyone, for George, it seemed to have stopped, trapped in the void of a painful and relentless absence. George's days followed the same pattern, like a rusted clock that insisted on ticking, but without purpose. Every morning he woke up with the first rays of sunlight filtering through his bedroom's thin curtains. He rose with difficulty, feeling the weight of the years in his bones, but never complained. He prepared a simple coffee, the aroma filling the empty apartment, but there was no one to share that moment. He sat at the table, alone, looking at the world outside the window where life continued without him. After coffee, George walked to the neighborhood market. It was a short route, but one he took with slow steps, as if prolonging the path in hopes that something unexpected might happen. The market was always bustling, but George had become invisible to others. People passed by him without noticing his presence, without imagining the stories he carried within him. He bought only the essentials, a routine so repeated that the clerk already knew what he would order before he even spoke. Afternoons were filled with long, solitary walks in the park. George enjoyed watching the trees change with the seasons, the gentle movement of the wind between the leaves, and the children running across the fields, laughing as he once did with his own children. But those memories now seemed distant, almost unreal. In the park, he didn't interact with anyone, just sat on the wooden bench with his trembling hands resting on his lap, observing the life around him as a silent spectator. Returning home, solitude awaited him at the door, as relentless as always. The apartment seemed even emptier in the afternoon when the sunlight was already fading, and shadows began to take over the rooms. George spent much of his time in his armchair, looking at the clock on the wall, which marked the hours with a muffled tick-tock. He did not expect visits. There were no phone calls, no knocks on the door. Silence had become the predominant sound of his existence. At night, his only company was the television, which he turned on more for the noise than for any interest in a program. The glow of the screen reflected in his tired eyes, but his mind wandered far from there. Sometimes he wondered how everything had come to this. How, from someone surrounded by family and friends, he had become an old and forgotten man. But George never allowed himself to dwell on these reflections for long. He had accepted his fate with the same serenity he handled his routine. There was nothing left to change. During meals he kept the habit of sitting at the table even when dining alone. He set the cutlery carefully, folded the napkin, and ate in silence as if at a formal dinner, even though the only voice he heard was that of a distant newscaster. It was his way of preserving dignity, even in the face of such a great void. There was something noble about not surrendering completely to neglect. His life might not have been grand, but he stood firm in his integrity. The hardest part of his day, however, was the nights. The silence, tolerable in the morning, became deafening at night. George sat by the window watching the city's lights in the distance. Sometimes he saw neighbors gathered for dinner, laughter escaping through open windows. He saw cars passing by, families returning home, and felt a weight in his chest, as if something was permanently missing from his life. Yet he shed no tears. Not anymore. In his bedroom, before sleeping, George kept the ritual of turning off the lights one by one, as if there were still someone he needed to say goodnight to. Darkness enveloped him and he lay down, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts wandered, but there were no grand dreams, just a sense of waiting, a silent waiting for the next day which would be just like the previous one. And so he closed his eyes, more from exhaustion than from a desire for rest. And so George's days passed, repeated like an old scratched vinyl record, spinning on the same spot. He had grown accustomed to the absence of emotion, to the absence of newness. But deep in his soul, there was still a small flame, a timid hope that something unexpected might happen, something that would break that hopeless routine that he carried as a light, but constant burden. A flame that he kept alive even without knowing exactly why. That day, George followed his routine as usual, walking to the park with slow and careful steps. The fresh morning air brought a sense of relief, though nothing seemed truly new to him. He sat on his usual bench, the old, worn-out wood, and watched the world around him with the empty gaze of someone who had already given up on waiting for surprises. It was then that he noticed the young woman. She wasn't there every day, but there was something different about the way she moved, as if time around her flowed more lightly. Amelia, with her long brown hair and a smile that seemed to brighten the environment, walked through the park with an almost unusual lightness. She wore a simple apron, a sign that she was probably coming from or going to work. She approached George, not out of obligation but out of genuine curiosity. "Good morning, sir," she said with a gentle and engaging voice as she stopped beside him. Her eyes, big and full of life, radiated an energy he hadn't felt in years. George, accustomed to being ignored by passers-by, was surprised to be addressed by someone so young. He looked at her with a concealed expression of surprise and responded with a shy nod. "Good morning," he murmured with a hoarse voice from the disuse of words. Amelia, sensing the old man's shyness, didn't push for immediate conversation. Instead, she sat on a nearby bench, enjoying the park's tranquility, as if her simple presence was enough. She didn't seem in a hurry. George, not knowing why, felt comfortable with the silence they shared. It wasn't the heavy silence of his loneliness, but something light, almost welcoming. Amelia looked at the sky, casually commenting on the weather and the surrounding trees. "The leaves are starting to change color. It's beautiful, isn't it?" Her voice was so gentle that George found himself agreeing, even though he had never noticed the colors of the leaves until that moment. In the days that followed, George noticed that Amelia passed through the park almost at the same time. She worked in a nearby cafe, which explained her constant presence, but what he didn't understand was why she always stopped to talk to him. He who was nobody important, just an invisible old man to the world. But to Amelia he seemed to be someone worthy of notice. With each good morning exchanged, with each smile, something inside George began to stir, though slowly. What touched him the most was the fact that Amelia treated him with a respect he hadn't received in a long time. There was no condescension in her words, nor the rush of someone who felt obligated to be polite to an elderly man. On the contrary, there was a genuine interest in her conversations. Once, she casually mentioned, "I like passing by here and seeing you. It makes me feel like the day starts a little more peacefully." George, surprised, just nodded, not knowing how to respond to such kindness. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, but her maturity was evident in the way she saw the world. George observed the sparkle in Amelia's eyes when she talked about simple things, like the smell of coffee that filled the cafe or the funny stories she witnessed at work. There was something pure in her presence, something that eased the loneliness he carried as an invisible burden. Gradually, he began to look forward to that daily encounter, though he wouldn't admit it, not even to himself. On one of those encounters, after a few days of exchanging only small words, Amelia came a little closer and commented with a smile, "You know, sir, I like your silence. It seems to say more than many conversations out there." For the first time in years, George let out a slight laugh. He wasn't used to being understood, much less in that way. Her simple phrase touched him more than any empty compliment he had ever heard in his life. At that moment, something changed. George realized that, as young and full of life as Amelia was, she saw him. Not as a burden, not as an insignificant figure, but as someone with stories to tell. And although he didn't know it yet, that unexpected encounter was the first step towards a profound change in his life. Amelia, with her kindness and respect, planted a seed of light in George's dark days, and he began, albeit timidly, to allow himself to feel something he had long forgotten: hope. As the days went by, conversations between George and Amelia became part of their routines. Initially, they were brief exchanges, comments about the weather or some trivial news. But gradually, something changed. Amelia began to talk a little more about her life, and George, listening with a silent curiosity. She never said too much, never forced the subject, but there was something in her words that captivated him. It wasn't what she said, but the way she said it, always with simple honesty and a lightness that he found in no one else. The young woman would tell him about her days at the cafe, the funny conversations with customers, the dreams she nurtured of maybe one day opening her own business. George listened attentively, as if her words were melodies that filled the empty spaces of his mind. Amelia didn't ask too many questions, which made him feel at ease. He began to talk about his past, small pieces of stories he had kept to himself. He spoke of his youth, of the times when life seemed more vibrant, as if, by speaking, he could briefly relive those moments. One day, as they were sitting in the park, Amelia casually asked, "And you, George? What did you like to do when you were younger?" George was silent for a moment, something rare for him. Not for lack of an answer, but because no one had asked him such a question in a long time. I like to travel. I went to many places, met interesting people. But it's been so long it feels like another life," he replied with a slight smile on his face. It was a melancholic smile, but somehow it was sincere. These conversations became a point of light in George's days. He found himself looking forward to seeing Amelia, and without realizing it, began planning his walks to coincide with the time she passed through the park. He felt less alone when they were together, and that was something he had given up hoping for. Amelia, on her part, never showed signs of wanting anything in return. Her presence was genuine, and George could feel that she was there because she wanted to be, not out of pity or obligation. On a sunny afternoon, as they walked side by side through the park, Amelia mentioned her dreams of studying more. "You know, George, I've always wanted to learn more about languages, maybe travel the world someday. But for now I'm happy where I am. Work is work, but meeting people like you makes my days lighter." George chuckled softly, something he hadn't done in a long time. "I don't know if I can offer much in return, Amelia, but thank you for being here." As the friendship grew, George began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. When he was with Amelia, the pains he carried, the frustrations of a life of abandonment, seemed to diminish. He couldn't explain why, but perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not with pity but with respect. That was what touched him. Amelia saw in him something that no one else did. And for the first time in many years, George began to feel that, despite everything, there was still something of value in him. Sometimes the conversation between them flowed like a calm river. Other times, silence spoke for itself. But it was never uncomfortable. It was as if both knew that each other's company was enough. On a cloudy afternoon, sitting on their usual bench, George looked at Amelia and commented, "It's funny, I spent so much time in silence that I forgot how good it is to talk." She smiled, that warm smile he had already come to appreciate. "I like talking to you too, George. I learn much more than you imagine." There was something therapeutic about those exchanges. George felt that, by sharing his memories, he was rescuing pieces of himself that had been lost over the years. He talked about his childhood, how the world was different, the sacrifices he made to raise his family. Amelia listened attentively, as if every word was a treasure. She never interrupted him, never rushed the stories. And George, who had remained silent for so long, discovered that he liked being heard again. With Amelia, the weight of loneliness seemed more bearable. The mornings were still lonely, the nights still long and silent, but there was something new in his life. A small spark of hope that he didn't dare name, but that made him look forward to their encounters with a joy he had forgotten existed. Amelia never knew how much she was transforming George's days, but for him each conversation, each smile exchanged, was a silent redemption. And for the first time in years, George allowed himself to believe that perhaps there was still something more to live for. George had always lived simply, dressing modestly and never allowing himself grand luxuries. To an outsider, it would seem that he lived with little, barely able to sustain the small apartment in which he lived. But there was a truth he kept to himself, a secret hidden deep within his history. George was a wealthy man. Years of hard work, cautious investments, and wise decisions had led him to accumulate a considerable fortune. However, unlike what many would do, he never flaunted his wealth. He remembered how it all began in his youth. He had always been a prudent man, thinking about the future even when life seemed generous. While his friends spent money on cars and trips, George preferred to save. He invested in stocks, land, opportunities that few saw value in. Over time, those small financial choices turned into a great fortune. He watched his bank balance grow year after year, but he never let it define him. Money to George was just a means, not an end. In the years when he was still surrounded by family, he never mentioned his wealth. He preferred that his children and grandchildren saw him as a simple man, someone who lived honestly and without extravagance. George believed that by keeping his fortune a secret, he would avoid problems, disputes, or any interest that wasn't genuine. However, over time he realized that his family had already distanced themselves emotionally, without even knowing the truth about his money. Even with the growing closeness to Amelia, George never spoke about his fortune. He felt that with her there was no need for masks, but he also didn't want money to change the dynamic between them. Amelia treated him with respect and affection, without ever expecting anything in return. The purity of this friendship was rare, and George didn't want to taint it with revelations about his financial status. Besides, he knew that Amelia would never change the way she treated him because of it, but merely mentioning the fortune seemed unnecessary. Every now and then, as Amelia talked about her dreams and projects, George found himself imagining how his wealth could help her. She wanted to open a small cafe, something more welcoming and intimate, but she knew it required resources she didn't have. In silence, he thought about how he could change her life with a single check. But at the same time there was a subtle fear. George dreaded that money, so impersonal and cold, could interfere with the most sincere thing in his life, their friendship. At night, as silence filled his apartment, George thought about the future. He knew that his time was limited, and soon he would have to make decisions about what to do with his fortune. The idea of leaving everything to his family brought him no comfort. On the contrary, the resentment he felt when thinking about how they abandoned him only grew. George didn't want his money to end up in the hands of those who had dismissed him and only saw him as a burden. He reflected deeply on how money could be a blessing or a curse. He had seen families destroyed by financial disputes, friends distanced by the power that money brings. George, however, saw his wealth as an opportunity to do something truly meaningful, something that went beyond the material. But to whom could he entrust such a responsibility? Who would deserve this chance to do good? On his walks through the park, where his mind felt lighter, George looked at Amelia with new eyes. She, with all her kindness and simplicity, had never asked him for anything. What she offered him, without knowing, was the most precious thing he had ever received: true companionship. George's fortune was immense, but by her side it seemed small. Still, he began to imagine that perhaps she was the only person worthy of knowing this hidden side of his life, someone who would not only use the money but give it a purpose. Even while keeping the secret, George began to feel that the time for revelations was approaching. The weight of his reflections increased with each encounter with Amelia, and although there was no rush in his words or actions, he knew the day would come. The phone rang on a gray afternoon, a call George no longer expected from his family. It was his son James on the other end, but the tone was distant, almost cold. There were no questions about his health or how he was feeling. There was no genuine interest in his life. The contact, so rare, had a single motivation: money. "Dad, we're going through some tough times. Could you help us?" It wouldn't be much, just enough to cover a few overdue bills. George, with a heavy heart, remained silent for a few moments, holding the phone with a trembling hand. He knew what that call meant. It wasn't an attempt at reconciliation, not a gesture of affection. His children saw him as a walking wallet, someone they only remembered when they needed something. Without hesitation, George replied firmly, "No, James. I can't help you this time. You'll have to find another way." James's reaction was immediate and cutting. "What do you mean you can't? You live alone without spending anything, and here we are with kids to take care of. What are you saving that money for if you're not even going to use it? Are you planning to die with it?" The words echoed through George's empty room, bouncing off the walls like sharp knives. The old man took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "My money won't solve your problems, James. That's something you need to deal with on your own." That conversation marked the definitive end of any family ties that might have still existed. James hung up without even saying goodbye, and the harsh words he had thrown lingered in George's mind for days. The old man sat in his armchair and looked out the window, the weight of loneliness growing even more on his shoulders. It wasn't just about the money. George understood that, in truth, there had never been genuine love between him and his children. Not in the way he had always wanted to believe. The visits, increasingly rare over the years, had been motivated by convenience, not by affection. The calls that once filled his life were, he now realized, just moments of financial interest disguised as concern. And now, with his refusal, he had sealed his fate. He was alone. The family he had dedicated his life to building had slipped away like sand through his fingers, driven by greed. In the days that followed, George waited in vain for another call, maybe an apology, a late reconciliation. But the phone never rang again. His children didn't need him for anything else, and as expected, they didn't want to know about his life either. The feeling of being seen as a burden, something useful only as long as it could provide money, gnawed at him from the inside. George felt that his life had been built on fragile foundations, and now, at the end of it all, those foundations were crumbling. One afternoon, while reflecting on all this, an old memory surfaced in his mind. The bitter words his father had told him years ago when George chose to follow a different path than the family had expected. Family is who you choose, not who is imposed on you. At the time, he had ignored the phrase, thinking it was just an excuse to justify his father's own distancing. But now it made more sense than ever. George finally began to accept that his relationship with his children was rooted in expectations and obligations, not in true love. And perhaps, despite the pain, it was better this way. By denying them the money, he cut the only superficial bond that still existed. What remained, he knew, wasn't pretty, but it was honest. And with that bitter truth, he moved on, aware that what really mattered could neither be bought nor sold. Despite everything, there was a strange sense of freedom in his chest. The definitive separation from his family, although painful, freed him from an impossible expectation to fulfill. For the first time in years, George no longer needed to please, nor maintain hope for a love that had never existed. He was free to live the remainder of his life as he saw fit, without worrying about the ties that once held him back. And in that silence that once suffocated him, George found something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Amelia's presence in George's life became something much more significant than he could have ever imagined. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but he began to notice that his days had a new brightness. Each time Amelia appeared in the park with her welcoming smile, George felt a wave of warmth pass through him, something he hadn't experienced since the days when his family still meant something to him. But what Amelia offered was different from anything he had ever felt. It was genuine, selfless, and it touched his soul in a way that sometimes left him speechless. George realized that, beside Amelia, he didn't need to hide his weaknesses, nor pretend to be something he wasn't. She saw him as a whole human being with his flaws, his stories, and his silences. And, as incredible as it seemed, that was all she wanted from him. His company. There were no requests, no expectations. Amelia was an oasis of tranquility amid the emotional desert that his life had become. When he was with her, he felt understood, something his own family had never been able to offer. As the weeks passed, George began to feel a deep gratitude for Amelia. She had become a ray of light in his dark life, bringing joy to the simplest moments, like walking in the park or sitting in the cafe where she worked. George, once so accustomed to silence, now longed for conversations with Amelia. Each encounter was an opportunity to dive into happy memories, share old stories, or simply listen to the hopes and dreams of the young woman who so charmed him. Amelia had a unique energy. She radiated a kind of calm joy that enveloped George in an aura of peace. The way she listened to him, as if each of his words was important, made him feel relevant, a feeling he no longer believed possible. George discovered, with pleasant surprise, that there was still room in his heart for affection. It wasn't romantic love, but something much deeper, a fondness based on the purity of Amelia's kindness. On a sunny day, as they walked together through the park, George looked at Amelia and felt a sense of completeness he hadn't felt in decades. "You brought me back to life, you know," he said, his voice choked. Amelia smiled, a smile full of compassion, but said nothing. She knew that George was opening up in a rare and precious way. The silence between them was comfortable, and George, who once felt crushed by loneliness, now felt that he was exactly where he should be. As this bond grew, George realized that Amelia was the only person he could completely trust. She had never shown interest in his financial or material situation, something that deeply surprised him. For Amelia, he was just George, a man with fascinating stories and a heart that still had much to offer. And that was all that mattered to her. George, in turn, felt that he had found something he had always sought in life: someone who loved him without asking for anything in return. With Amelia, George rediscovered the joy of small things. The feeling of a good coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on his face during walks, and even the gentle breeze that passed through the trees. They were simple moments, but laden with meaning when shared with someone who truly cared. He smiled more. Sometimes, alone in his apartment, he would recall a joke or a conversation with Amelia, and a smile would appear on his face, something rare in recent years. More than a friend, Amelia had become the only family George felt he really had. She made him feel alive again, and that was a gift he didn't know how to repay. Not with money, not with material gifts, but with his silent gratitude and constant presence. He knew that Amelia's life had its own battles, its own challenges, but even so she was always there, illuminating his days in a way no one ever had. For George, Amelia was proof that genuine love and compassion could arise in the most unexpected places. He had lost hope that anyone would care for him in the way Amelia did. And for that he felt that his life somehow was being saved. The time with her was the antidote to years of abandonment, and George, with a renewed heart, felt that perhaps for the first time in a long time, he could leave this world with a peace he never believed he would find. As the months passed, George began to notice the subtle changes in his body. The walks that once brought a sense of freedom now became shorter, the steps slower. There was a constant pain in his joints, a fatigue that seemed never to disappear, even after a night's sleep. He knew that age was finally taking its toll. The life that Amelia had rekindled in his heart was beginning to show signs that the remaining time would be limited. George wasn't the type to complain about his pains. He bore them with the same dignity with which he had dealt with loneliness for so many years. But Amelia, always attentive, began to notice the changes. "Are you more tired today, George?" she would ask gently, a worried look on her face. George would smile, trying to deflect. "Age, my friend, is relentless. But I'm fine. Don't worry." Amelia never pressed him, but she was always there, ready to help, even without him asking. The trips to the doctor became inevitable. Exams, consultations, prescriptions filled his weeks, and George hated every minute inside those white, impersonal rooms. Amelia, however, was by his side, holding his hand firmly, never showing any signs of fatigue or impatience. During one of those consultations, the doctor gave him the diagnosis George had already suspected. His heart, like the rest of him, was weakening. The end wasn't imminent, but he knew that time, that eternal enemy, was running against him. Despite the difficulties, George refused to let the illness define his final days. He continued to go to the park, to sit on the same bench, to observe the world around him. Each morning when he awoke and saw the sunlight streaming through the curtains, he felt a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. He was still here, but he knew that goodbye was approaching. And that made him reflect on what really mattered, on what he would leave behind. The family, as expected, remained absent. No visits, no calls. George was no longer surprised by his children's silence, but somehow, this definitive absence freed him from any expectation. He had accepted that his life would proceed without reconciliations or apologies, and that, though painful, helped him focus on the present. Amelia, always constant, had become the only person he trusted, the only one who wouldn't abandon him as he struggled with his frailty. On a particularly difficult afternoon, when the pain in his chest prevented him from going to the park, George sat in his rocking chair and looked out the window. The world outside kept spinning, indifferent to his struggle. "My time is running out, Amelia," he said in a rare moment of vulnerability. Amelia, who was by his side, simply held his hand gently. "I know, George, but I'm still here with you." Her words, though simple, brought a calmness he didn't know he needed. It was that night that George began to think about the future, about what he would leave after his departure. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about material things. It was about who deserved to carry on his legacy, who had truly been by his side. Amelia, with her kindness and loyalty, was the only person he could imagine. She, who had never asked for anything, who had never expected rewards, was the only one worthy of receiving what he had spent his life accumulating, but which now, only now, seemed meaningful to share. As dusk fell, George felt an urgency to put his plans into action. He knew he didn't have much time and needed to act before it was too late. There was a calmness in his heart, though, as he made this choice. He felt that, finally, something in his life was coming together. It wasn't the end he had envisioned years ago, surrounded by children and grandchildren, but it was a worthy end. He had found someone who truly cared about him, and that was more than he could have asked for. In the days that followed, George began to plan silently, with Amelia always nearby, but without ever revealing the depth of his thoughts. He knew that when the time came she would be surprised, but he also hoped she would understand. Amelia had been his light, his redemption, and he wanted to ensure that somehow she would continue to shine, even when he was no longer around. That early autumn, George made the most important decision of his life. With the leaves changing colors, the wind blowing softly through the streets, he went to his lawyer's office, a man of trust who had been with him for years. Sitting in an elegant and silent room, George looked at the papers in front of him and took a deep breath. He was about to do something that he knew would change everything. "I want to change my will," he said, with a calmness that surprised even the lawyer. The lawyer raised his eyes, surprised. George had always been clear about his intentions to leave his inheritance to his family, despite the evident estrangement. "Are you sure, George?" he asked, sliding a pen across the desk. "Yes, I'm sure." George's voice was firm, without hesitation. The decision had not been made impulsively. Amelia, the only person who had truly cared about him in recent years, was the one who deserved his inheritance. It wasn't just about the money, it was about gratitude, recognition, and above all, justice. With slow but determined gestures, George began to explain how he wanted everything to be done. Amelia would be the sole heir of his considerable fortune, and he wanted to ensure that there was no room for contest. He knew that when his family found out, they would be furious and would likely try to fight for the money. So, he gave precise instructions to the lawyer. Everything had to be done in the safest and most legal way possible, so that no one could contest the decision. "I can predict what will happen when they find out," George said, his voice somewhat somber. "My family will appear like vultures around a carcass. But I've already accepted that. They don't want me, they want what I have." The lawyer, who had known him for so long, simply nodded, understanding the depth of George's pain. He knew that this was a mature decision, born from a life of disappointments and a sincere love for the only person who treated him with respect until the end. As the hours passed in the office, George felt a sense of relief wash over him. He was, in a way, closing a cycle. By naming Amelia as his sole heir, he was ensuring that his fortune would have a greater purpose. She had never asked for anything, never hinted that she expected anything, and perhaps that's why he felt she was the only person worthy of receiving his inheritance. George didn't want the money to become just a burden that would bring even more greed and resentment to his family. When he finished signing the papers, George looked out the window, watching the leaves dancing in the wind. The image seemed to reflect what he felt at that moment. The leaves, detaching from the trees, represented the end of a cycle, but also the promise of renewal. He knew that he wouldn't have much time left, but now there was a sense of peace. He had done what needed to be done, and that gave him a silent comfort. He looked at the lawyer and with a slight smile said, "This is right. It's how it should be." The lawyer gathered the papers, storing them in a secure vault. "Don't worry, George. Everything will be done according to your wishes." George stood up from the chair, feeling the weight of the decision, but also the lightness of having fulfilled his last great task. He left the office with his head held high, the fresh air hitting his face. The autumn sun illuminated his path, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. In the days that followed, George continued to meet Amelia at the park, but he never mentioned what he had done. He knew she would be shocked to discover the will, and he wanted to keep that moment for after his departure. During their conversations, he observed her with silent affection, knowing that he had made the right choice. Amelia represented everything his family never was. Kindness without interest, friendship without conditions. Each day that passed, George felt that his choice was complete. He no longer cared what his family would think or how angry they would be. What mattered now was that Amelia, the young woman who had brought light into his final years, would be able to turn his inheritance into something meaningful. The money held no value to him, but in the right hands, it could make a difference in the life of someone who truly deserved it. And with that in mind, George found the peace he had sought for so long. The morning that George passed away was like any other, silent and calm. He was in his rocking chair, wrapped in the gentle light that filtered through the curtains of his small apartment. The sun had not yet fully risen, but the dawn's light bathed the room in a tranquility that matched his final moments. George, at peace with his choices, closed his eyes for the last time without pain, without fanfare. Just a light sigh, as if he were finally releasing the weight of an entire life. When Amelia arrived that afternoon, as she always did, something seemed different. She knocked on the door, and as there was no answer, she entered with her usual care. She called out for George, but the silence was absolute, a silence different from other days. Seeing him there, motionless in the chair, Amelia immediately understood what had happened. Her heart tightened and tears filled her eyes, but there was no despair. George had departed as he had lived his last years, quietly without bothering anyone. She approached him with care, holding his cold, lifeless hand. There was something serene in his expression, a calmness that made her feel he had found the peace he so deserved. Amelia did not cry immediately. Instead, she stayed by George's side for a while in silence, reflecting on everything he meant to her. It was as if that moment belonged only to the two of them, a final farewell before the world outside knew of his passing. Without being asked, Amelia took responsibility for arranging the funeral details. She knew that George had no one else who genuinely cared about him. His family was distant, absent until the very end. So, with care and dedication, Amelia took all the necessary steps. She chose simple flowers, the kind George had always mentioned liking during their walks, and organized a modest ceremony, just as he would have liked. While making calls and signing papers, Amelia did not think of herself. All the care she dedicated to the funeral was a way to honor George's memory, to repay the quiet kindness he had always shown her. There was no one else to mourn for him, so she allowed herself to be that person. And in doing so, she felt the weight of longing settle in her chest. She did not cry for an inheritance, nor did she expect anything in return. Amelia cried for the man who, in his simplicity, had changed her life. In the days leading up to the funeral, Amelia spent more time in George's apartment, arranging the few things he had. Each object seemed to carry a part of his story. The rocking chair where he had spent so many afternoons, the aged books that told tales of a distant time, even the old coat hanging by the door, all held special meaning for her. Sitting in the room, surrounded by his memories, Amelia felt the void left by his absence. When the day of the funeral arrived, the sky was overcast, as if nature itself reflected the silent sadness of the moment. Few people attended. Some neighbors, perhaps out of courtesy, and, of course, Amelia, who was there not just out of duty but out of love. She remained silent throughout the ceremony, watching the casket descend, but inside, there was a mix of pain and gratitude. George had departed in peace, and she knew she had done everything she could to honor his memory. As the others dispersed after the funeral, Amelia stayed until the last moment. With tearful eyes, she knelt before the grave, feeling the cold wind against her face. "Thank you, George," she whispered, her voice choked. "Thank you for everything." And at that moment, she realized that, although George had passed away, his presence would continue to live in her heart. The silence around her seemed to echo the same gratitude, a silent farewell laden with meaning. Amelia knew that mourning would be a solitary process, but she had found something invaluable in her friendship with George. And as she walked away from the cemetery, she felt that somehow he was still there beside her, present in every memory, in every gesture of kindness he had taught her to cultivate. News of George's death spread slowly, but as soon as it reached his family's ears, the response was immediate. James, the eldest son, was the first to call, not to offer condolences, but to confirm the details of the funeral that had already taken place. He was clearly irritated for not being informed sooner. "How could we not have been told in time? We're his family," he said with a tone that mixed offense and haste. It was obvious that his primary concern was not George's loss but rather what he had left behind. Laura, George's daughter, soon appeared, talking about her father as if she had been present in his life in recent years, although any real contact had ceased long ago. "Dad and I were so close. I always thought about him, you know? He was a special man," she said to anyone who would listen. But the words sounded empty, without substance, and Amelia, watching from a distance, knew very well that the love Laura described had never truly existed. The grandchildren, who barely knew George, arrived shortly after, exchanging glances and whispers, as if they were at a social gathering and not a moment of mourning. "I heard he lived alone. He must have left something, right?" one of them murmured, glancing at Amelia, who remained silent. The coldness and distance between the family and the man who had just passed away were so obvious that each gesture seemed rehearsed, as if they were following a script where the inheritance was the grand prize at the end. The days following George's death were marked by phone calls and insistent messages from his children, all with the same disguised concern. They wanted to know about the assets, the accounts, and especially the will. "You know who's handling this, don't you?" James asked, trying to sound casual. He and Laura, despite showing no interest during George's life, now behaved as if they were the rightful heirs of a man they had ignored for years. The hypocrisy reached its peak when James began talking about how he had always been concerned about his father. "I just wanted him to be okay, you know? Even though we didn't see each other much, I thought about him all the time," he said to a neighbor who, out of politeness, nodded, pretending to believe his empty words. It was an uncomfortable scene, as if James was trying to convince himself that there really was some connection with his father when in truth, that bond had long been broken. Laura, for her part, began to explore George's apartment with eyes that seemed to measure each object. "He was always simple, but he must have saved something valuable," she commented in a low tone, while discreetly rummaging through drawers and cabinets. The family moved through the space that had once been a refuge of silence and solitude, as if they were on a treasure hunt. There was no genuine sadness, only a silent expectation of what they might gain. During these days, Amelia observed everything from a distance, trying to process what she saw. It was hard for her to understand how these people, who had so clearly abandoned George, were now there, pretending a grief they did not feel. They spoke of him as if he were a stranger, someone whose existence only mattered now that it involved money. And that filled her with a deep sadness, not for herself, but for the fact that George knew this would happen. He had foreseen this charade, and now, even in death, he faced the coldness of his own family. James's emotional speech at the memorial was the final straw. With a choked voice, he spoke of the amazing man George had been, and how he and his sister had always loved him. "Dad taught us so much about life. He will be greatly missed," he said, wiping eyes that curiously shed no tears. Amelia, who knew the truth, remained silent, feeling a weight in her heart for George, who would surely have preferred his death to be marked by honesty, not by this hollow pretense. And so George's family waited eagerly for the reading of the will, as if it were the final act of a poorly rehearsed play. To them, George's death was merely the prelude to something greater, the financial reward they believed they were about to receive. The mourning, no matter how feigned, was already being set aside, replaced by excitement and greed as the moment they had been waiting for drew near. The lawyer's office was filled with tension that day. James and Laura sat with anxious looks, barely concealing the anticipation bubbling inside them. The grandchildren, leaning on nearby chairs, exchanged impatient whispers, all waiting for the moment the will would finally be read. In everyone's mind, the same certainty: George's fortune was now within reach. They already pictured themselves dividing the money, discussing how they would spend every penny. They saw themselves as millionaires even before hearing a word. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, adjusted his glasses and opened the sealed envelope containing George's will. The silence in the room was palpable. He cleared his throat, slightly uncomfortable, and began the formal reading. The first paragraphs were procedural, describing George's life journey, his assets, and his possessions. But as he approached the crucial point, the room seemed to narrow. All eyes were fixed on the lawyer, as if each following word would be the gateway to the long-awaited fortune. "I, George Edward Harris, declare that upon my death, all my assets, bank accounts, investments, and properties will be left to..." The lawyer paused briefly, and at that moment, James and Laura's faces lit up. They were sure the next name would be one of theirs. Perhaps, for a second, they even started mentally planning how they would split everything between them. But then, the lawyer finished the sentence: "Amelia Martins." The shock was immediate. A deep silence took over the room, followed by a collective sigh of disbelief. Laura, unable to process what she had heard, let out a bitter laugh as if it were some kind of joke. "Excuse me, what?" she stammered, still not understanding. "This can't be right. Amelia? How is that possible?" James, on the other hand, seemed paralyzed, his face contorted with confusion and anger. He leaned forward in his chair, almost lunging at the lawyer. "Is this some kind of mistake?" But there was no mistake. The lawyer, maintaining his composure, calmly explained that George had left detailed and legal instructions for all his wealth to be given to Amelia. No loopholes, no error. Everything was exactly as George had expressed. He had foreseen this exact moment, and that's why he had taken all precautions to ensure his wish would be fulfilled without contest. Each word in the document was final. But she's not even family," James shouted, suddenly standing up, his face red with fury. Laura, beside him, shook her head in denial, still unable to accept the reality before her. "This is crazy. We are his children. This money is ours by right." She banged on the table, almost breathless, hoping the lawyer or anyone else would somehow change what was written in that will. Amelia, who was sitting at the back of the room, watched everything in silence, her heart tight. She had never expected this. She had never even imagined that George would leave her something so grand. While James and Laura raged, Amelia felt a mixture of sadness and responsibility. She knew that for George, this decision wasn't about money, but about love, about who had been there for him when he needed it most. And now, even in death, George had been true to himself. "This won't stand," James yelled, his voice trembling with anger. "We'll contest this will." Laura, beside him, furiously agreed as if there was still a way to reverse it all. But the lawyer, undisturbed, explained firmly, George's decision is uncontestable. He took all the necessary legal measures. I'm sorry, but there's nothing to be done. The anger in the room was palpable. The grandchildren's whispers had ceased, and now, everyone looked at Amelia as if she were the villain of this story. But Amelia, with teary eyes, did not defend herself. She hadn't asked for any of this. George made his decision in life, and she, in her silent gratitude, accepted it. While the others exploded in indignation, she felt the depth of George's gesture. He had entrusted her with what was most valuable, not the money, but the legacy of who he had been. Amelia spent weeks reflecting on the legacy George had left her. She felt grateful but also carried a weight in her heart. The money in itself meant nothing to her. What really mattered was how George, in his final years, had taught her the value of compassion, of presence, of affection. He had never needed material possessions. He needed someone who saw him beyond his frailty, who loved him for the man he was. And now, it was her turn to repay that kindness meaningfully. It was one afternoon, while walking in the park where they always met, that Amelia had an idea that would change everything. Sitting on the bench where so many conversations had taken place, she decided that George's inheritance would not be just for her. With her heart full of determination, she decided to use part of the fortune to create an institution in his name, a place where elderly people like George could find support, care, and dignity, a refuge for those who had been forgotten by family, but who still had so much to offer. The George Harris House was inaugurated months later, a home dedicated to caring for abandoned elderly people, where they received care and, more importantly, companionship. The inauguration was an emotional moment for Amelia. George's name, so mistreated by those who should have cared for him, would now be remembered as a symbol of compassion and rebirth. Amelia's smile as she cut the inauguration ribbon was a mixture of sadness and joy. She knew that, wherever George was, he would be proud of how his memory would be preserved. Meanwhile, George's family faced a very different reality. After the shock of the will, James and Laura drifted apart, which was no surprise. The bond that had united them had always been fragile, sustained only by the expectation of an inheritance that never came. Without George's money, they were forced to confront their own choices and the life they had neglected. There was no reconciliation, no understanding, only the emptiness left by greed. And that emptiness, which they had once tried to fill with wealth, now consumed them. The grandchildren, who barely knew their grandfather, soon distanced themselves from the whole situation. The promise of easy wealth had evaporated, and with it, any interest in George or his story. The family, once united by the illusion of a grand financial legacy, was now divided and disillusioned. There was no real mourning, no reflection on what they had truly lost. They drifted apart, each following their own path, trapped in their own bitterness. Amelia, on the other hand, flourished. With the George Harris house in operation, she felt that she had finally given a greater purpose to the inheritance she had received. Every day she visited the home, talked to the elderly, listened to their stories, and saw in them the reflection of George. In each grateful look, in each smile, Amelia saw the living legacy of her friend. He hadn't left just money. He had left her the mission to do good, to create an impact that would resonate for generations. One afternoon, while sitting in her office at the home, Amelia found an old photo of George, which she had kept with care. He was sitting in his rocking chair with a serene gaze, watching life outside, unaware that even after his departure, he would continue to touch so many lives. She held the photo tenderly, feeling a tear slide softly down her face. "Thank you, George," she whispered, her heart filled with gratitude. "I hope I'm honoring you as you deserve." Time passed, and the George Harris house grew, becoming a point of reference in the city, a place where the elderly found not just shelter but a home. And so, George's memory lived on, not in the material possessions he left behind, but in the lives that were transformed by his generosity. Amelia, now admired for her dedication, knew that her life would never be the same from the moment she met George in the park. He taught her the value of human connections, of love that transcends time and money. The story of George and Amelia came to an end, but not without first leaving a deep mark on the world around them. A man who, in his loneliness, found a friend, and a woman who, through that friendship, discovered her purpose. The cycle closed there, with George's legacy flourishing in every smile, in every act of compassion, in every new life touched by the kindness he silently spread. If you enjoyed the incredible story of George and Amelia, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love heartfelt stories and would like to support our channel so we can continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next touching story.